I got to tell you, this book scared me a little. And I would guess it scares many people in some ways because it uses imagery and words and ideas that we're not really comfortable talking about publicly. But I think we'll see that this book is really a love poem. And it's designed to help us understand the wonderful relationship between people who commit to and love one another long term. So let's mosey on there.
That goes with today's 50 plus.
It did. I was thinking that myself as we were talking about that. What a beautiful example of what this book is about in terms of commitment and love. So most writers say there are three pretty important things we need to talk about as we dive into this book. The first is, who's the author of the book? Is it Solomon, because it's called Song of Solomon? Is it about Solomon? There are some people who think he's one of the characters in the poems. Or maybe it was just written under his oversight during his lifetime. So it's not clear who the author of this book actually was. We have to look at the kind of literature that we're reading because it's a little different than the literature we've been used to looking at as we've traveled through these books of wisdom. And then we need to talk about who the characters are that we hear speaking. So the first question, who wrote this book? The very first verse of chapter 1 says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, which is pretty vague. So is it Solomon's song? Did he write it? How do we do that? There are many sources that suggest Solomon probably isn't the greatest expert on commitment and marriage, since he had something like 700 wives and several concubines and really was hardly an expert on what a healthy, loving relationship might be like. So attributing authorship for this book has been difficult for folks to do. The book is a collection of love poems, and these kinds of collections were pretty common in the culture of Israel at that time, not necessarily collections of love poems, but collections of stories that were brought forward to help the people understand contexts and issues. So to call it the Song of Songs suggests that, like we say Holy of Holies or King of Kings, this song was one that was felt to be superior to others that might have been part of this collection. So the second question seems to be, what kind of literature are we looking at? And this genre seems to be unique in the Old Testament. There are some people who call it a drama that tells the story of two lovers, and who those lovers are is debatable. Is it King Solomon and the shepherdess? Is it a shepherdess and a shepherd? Others call it an allegory. Is it about God's relationship to Israel, about Christ's relationship with the church? And still others suggest it's merely a collection of poems that celebrate sexual love. And these poems are connected through repeated imagery, settings, themes, and characters. But they don't necessarily move in a linear fashion. They kind of roll and amble through the story. So some suggest an outline to the story that could look like this. So we start where the two lovers are at home in the countryside, developing love. Then there's the first dream sequence. Then there's consummation of their love. Then another dream sequence that goes back to love continuing to grow and journeying back to the country. And Hebrew stories often followed what is called this chiastic structure, that there's a central piece, meaning that dream sequence and the consummation in the dream sequence, which moves outward in both directions symmetrically. So the beginning and the end will match, and they all kind of relate to that central piece. Interesting way to describe the structure of a story. So in this way, the poems really kind of intertwine rather than progress linearly. We don't go from this to this to this, but we bring a lot of concepts together. So then the question is, who is speaking? The first scenario suggests that it's King Solomon and a young shepherdess. But then we wonder, would the king really be tending his vineyards and flocks himself? Would he be the one out in the field? And if this romance was such a deep and sincere one, why does Solomon have all these other women in his court? So there are folks who suggest that perhaps King Solomon, although might be mentioned in this story, is not one of the central figures. The second scenario said there are three characters, King Solomon, a young shepherdess, and a shepherd. That King Solomon falls in love with the shepherdess and brings her into his court, but she's really in love with the shepherd and seeks to leave Solomon. It's unlikely that Solomon would be an interloper or kind of pop into a story that is dedicated to him in many ways. And the third scenario says that it's a shepherd and a shepherdess, that the poems are a series of exchanges between a young peasant couple. In her eyes, he seems to be as wonderful as King Solomon. In his eyes, she's a royal princess, which may lead to the royal kind of wording that we see used throughout this story. So how are the voices identified in your translation? My online Bible says he, she, and friends. Other people say young shepherdess, and chorus. What are the headings in yours as the voices are progressing? Anything different than that?
Lover and beloved.
Lover and beloved.
He, she, friends.
He, she, friends. Any others that are different than that? So clearly we're all kind of trying to figure out who these folks are and how they are identified. In any case, I like this quote from the author of the book that I've been using. Many of us are used to reading the Bible with left brain rationalism rather than right brain artistry. The Song of Solomon as poetry is meant to spark our imagination, stir our emotions, and awaken all of our senses. Don't let the enigmas of this book rob you of its joy and beauty. And I like that statement. Don't get hung up on things that might be hang-upable, but enjoy the beauty and the joy of the story. So we've been working our way through the Old Testament's wisdom books, and it's kind of looking at these books, if you remember, as we've gone through the last 9 weeks. Look at how a wise person lives under God's authority, how a wise person suffers, how he praises God, how he laments his difficult circumstances. We've seen how a person who fears the Lord chooses a path to pursue. And last week we saw how a person who lives under the sun instead of under God's rule finds emptiness and loneliness, while a person whose life is united to Christ finds meaning and purpose. So this week we're going to look at how a wise person living in covenant with his or her Creator enjoys God's good gift of sexual desire. So Song of Solomon appears to be this cycle of poetry about two lovers set in a flowery and fruitful rural landscape. There are some who suggest these lovers may be Adam and Eve before they became ashamed, while they were still enjoying the luxury of the Garden of Eden and each other and the purpose that they had for each other's love and adoration. It's unapologetically sexual as it talks about marital love. And while it's erotic, it isn't vulgar. And I think we need to look at a difference between erotic and pornographic. Many people see those as the same words, and they're really very different. So the erotic approaches sex indirectly and with restraint, while the pornographic goes straight to the issue and with no restraint. The erotic has depth and dimension and approaches people as subjects in relationships. The pornographic is shallow and designed for immediate sexual gratification and concerned with people only as objects of sexual stimulation. Do you agree with those differentiations?
One is giving and one is taking.
That's a good way to say it. The erotic is a giving of a loving relationship. Pornographic is more taking something not very wonderful from that relationship. Selfish, yeah. Any other ways that you see the difference between those two words? I think, go ahead.
I would say one thing that might be the same is they both would be maybe addictive, but one is good and one is bad.
True. True, that's a good point as well. So I have sometimes thought of the word eroticism as a negative word, and I think in many ways it is not. It is, as we've said, a giving, an appreciation of a relationship. So the Song of Solomon is described as being refreshingly realistic and an unembarrassed ode to human sexuality. It's not a how-to manual, nor is it a moral treatise. It's not telling us how to have sex. It's not making judgments about a sexual relationship. But it shows us that sexual love, as it was meant to be, should not be a taboo subject for polite company, but actually a cause for public celebration. I don't know about you, but the first couple times Curtis said the word sex from the pulpit, I kind of was like, where are we going here? And I've gotten over that. But I think this book helps us understand why we can get over that and why it's important to view that sexuality positively. So what do you think the writer of this book, whoever it was, wanted to communicate to its original readers, which is the kingdom of Israel living under the rule of Solomon? Why is this book even here? What was this author trying to say?
Maybe people were looking for love in all the wrong places.
That sounds like a song title. That could be.
And be out of a selfish way to be that way. And they don't know that they're missing the most wonderful gift because of their selfishness.
Well, and it seemed to be a time when Solomon and his 700 wives and concubines was not atypical. I mean, that was a fairly common practice to have many, a harem or many women for one man. What else do you think he wanted them to see?
I think to be vulnerable with each other and know each other heart to heart. And then the sensuality and eroticism is a natural extension from that. Mm-hmm. Whereas not opening up to one another and being vulnerable and getting to know our hearts and being the subject of one's desires, not the object of one's desires, is the path we should follow. That's what we should be seeking.
I think you're absolutely right with that. I think that the writer was trying to say, let's look at the depth of a relationship. Let's look at what a relationship means and is, and how we can work to celebrate the wonders that God has given us in that kind of a relationship.
I was thinking too about something that keeps coming to mind, that it's such a creation of God. You know, we're celebrating God's creation and what He created.
Exactly. That kind of leads us to the next slide. And God said it is good. It's a sexual relationship between a man and a woman who are committed to one another is beautiful and good. It's an important aspect. And sex is about pleasure, and pleasure is a gift from God. So it's also clear, though, that there are boundaries and restraints for enjoying that pleasure. It's not a hedonistic or pornographic or erotic without understanding that we're talking about. As you said, sex can be addictive in some ways, whether it's positive or negative, and sex is powerful. And at least twice in the Song of Solomon, we're admonished not to stir up or awaken love until its proper time. What do you think that means? Twice the friends of the young maiden advise not to stir up or awaken love until its proper time. What is its proper time?
Don't forget knowing each other deeply.
Okay, so first of all, having that commitment.
And depth of knowledge of one another.
What else?
But it implies that you have a choice. You can either do it the right way or the wrong way. There's a choice there, and we're being admonished to do it the right way.
Okay. Anything else?
That's the phrase that argues against Solomon being the subject, because there's no way you can know hundreds of women deeply.
Yeah, so Solomon's probably not the major player in this love story. Yeah. But in its proper time, I think having this kind of a deeply committed kind of relationship doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to learn and explore and develop that trust and love for one another. And I found this statement interesting. Sex is never just sex, but it arouses intense jealousy. It imprints us deep in our souls. Everyone to whom we join ourselves pulls away, taking a piece of us that we can never get back. And in a positive relationship, that's great. In a not so positive relationship, that's not a nice feeling to have given that away. What is it imprints us deep in our souls? I remember the duck experiment, the ducks imprinting on their mothers and following them so that they knew how to go from place to place. So what does this mean? It imprints us deep in our souls.
Some verses that came to mind are the one, and I can't remember where they are, but it talks about sins that you commit with your body, and it differentiates them with sins that are committed otherwise. And somehow it sounds like it's worse if the sin, although if sin is sin, but, and I can't remember what those verses are, someone may remember that, but where out of context, if you're sexually immoral, you're using your body itself as an instrument of sin. And that's kind of like what we're saying here. There's something about our own body that there's something deep in there. It's kind of hard to explain, but I feel like those verses kind of go together a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot where those verses are, but maybe someone knows what I'm talking about.
I don't know what you're talking about, but someone may. But I think you're right. It's when our own body is the instrument of the sin, it's pretty deeply felt, or should be pretty deeply felt as we realize that sin. And even the best sex leaves us with a longing. The young shepherdess has been with her love and she's experienced the best that love has to offer, but she still finds herself wanting more. She calls out to him to come back, to be with her. And human sexual love, no matter how satisfying in the moment, provides no final or lasting satisfaction. We hunger for more. So this is positive within a loving and stable relationship, but outside of that relationship, it can be unsettling. Whether you're married or single, sexually satisfied or sexually frustrated, sexually hopeful or sexually defeated, the author of our book asks if you would allow this Song of Songs above all other songs to point you toward the beauty of sexual love inside the bonds of marriage, and more significantly toward the lover of your soul, Jesus Christ. If you look at the big picture message of this book, at the joy of sexual oneness in marriage, we see the physical expression of a spiritual reality. Interesting.
I found those verses.
Great. Where are they?
1 Corinthians 6, and it is about sexual immorality, but it talks about the oneness that was supposed to be there. And then it says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So our body is really a temple of God. Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of talks about how these verses kind of went with that screen before where it's I forgot exactly what it said there, my old age here. But it kind of, to me, it just, these verses came up. Yeah, it imprints us deep in our souls. And the Holy Spirit's in there, in our bodies. So.
That's a good point, and thank you for finding those so we have that reference. Yeah, our bodies are a temple. They're to be celebrated. They're special gifts from God. So the author again says that the sexual union of a husband and wife is a shadow or a picture of Christ's relationship with his people. Christ's love for his church is passionate and personal and costly. We see love that plunged Jesus into the burning flames of God's wrath so that we might not be scorched by its fire. Many waters cannot quench Christ's love, and neither can floods drown it. His love for us cannot be bought, but is given to us at great cost. So if Christ showered his love on us freely, how important is that for us to share that love and model that love in our relationships with our spouse? So in the book, the author shows this 19th century hymn called Here is Love, and I liked it because it's going to lead us to somewhere else. Here is love, vast as the ocean, loving kindness as the flood. When the Prince of Life, our ransom, shed for us his precious blood. On the mount of crucifixion, fountains opened deep and wide. Through the floodgates of God's mercy flowed a vast and gracious tide. Grace and love, like mighty rivers, poured incessant from above. And heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed a guilty world with love. That concept of kissing and sharing that kind of intimacy is talked about a lot as the author of the book describes this premise. And how many television shows and movies have we seen where kissing is passionate and also some where it's tender and a show of love and mercy. So her premise is that this kiss that we symbolize as the intimacy and the connection is really something that we need to think about. So we're told that ultimate and lasting satisfaction is not found in the most delicious of human kisses. We find our ultimate and lasting satisfaction not in the best human lover, but in divine redeeming love poured out on guilty sinners. The kiss that will satisfy us into eternity is the kiss of God in Jesus Christ, the crucified Lord. This is the kiss that heals and makes us whole. Talk with me about that for a minute. Makes sense? Bring up more questions?
It's kind of the allegorical representation. You know, we have things on earth that God blessed us with, and the gift of commitment and devotion. And, you know, we celebrated today. And how much more is it to seek and know God for eternal love and devotion that's unbreakable, can't be marred by death of physical death, losing your loved one you've been with for 50 years, which is worth it, but yet still it's a grievous process. With God, it's even better.
I think of that as I am the breath of life, I am the light of the world, I am the kiss of eternal mercy and grace. All of the things that we have been taught to believe about our Lord get summarized, I think, in this statement. So throughout this study, and I thought I was not going to have time, and we're going to probably finish early. Throughout this study, we sought to grasp how the passages that we're reading point us into the bigger picture of God's plan. We looked at Job, we looked at the Psalms, we looked at Proverbs, we looked at Ecclesiastes, and we kind of talked about how those prepared us or pointed us toward God in our world. So what future hope does the Song of Solomon point us toward?
Well, the Creator has something even better in store for us.
Mm-hmm. A loving relationship with the Creator is something to be desired and to be hungering for. Other things?
This is a book that none of us have probably studied to the point that we should. And it is, I think it's difficult for many of us to wrap our brains around, and I'm thinking of the next words in this sentence on the fly here, to wrap our brains around the relationship between sexuality and the love of God. For some reason, at least in my mind, those two just don't work together very well. But I think that's the point of the book, or one of the points of the book anyway, is the comparison between the two. And it's just tough sometimes to swipe the cobwebs away and take a look at this book in ways that we might believe that God would have us do. And there are different interpretations. I wasn't in the first part of the class here, but there are different interpretations of this book. And it's always, well, it has to be this or it has to be this. Why can't it be both? Why can't it be both and rather than either or?
Exactly.
If the Bible is what we think it is, if the Bible is inspired as we think that it is, surely whoever wrote this, whether Solomon or whoever it is, could have, with inspiration of the Spirit, done a both and rather than just an either or. And I know I didn't directly answer your question, but
You came close.
Maybe one reason why we're reluctant a little bit to even say something here.
When I first thought about this book, I wondered, why on earth is this considered part of the wisdom books of the Bible? What is the connection that draws the other books that we've been studying and this book together? And I think I came to a bit of an answer, but I'd be interested in what your response to that might be. Why is this book here and how does it fit?
Well, this certainly would be an area of life where many people are not very wise.
Mm-hmm. And to see this love story and the admonitions in this love story would be instructive, provide some wisdom.
I think we should also thank God for this gift. And in the right context, we would be thanking God for what He's given us.
Other thoughts about that?
I think it beautifully illustrates what Curtis alluded to this morning as far as tradition can be good, but it can be not so good either because it can be rote and it can be mechanical and we can, it's like when our kids grow old and they don't depart from the Lord's way, or they'll come back to the Lord's ways. It's because of making it their own, not just what the Lord or what their parents sought in the Lord, but seeking God on their own right, autonomously from their parents. The difference between tradition, what you were grown up with, and making it your own. And I think this kind of beautifully illustrates that. Do we go to church and worship God because that's what all we know? Or is it because we have a relationship with the Lord and we come and seek Him and to know Him and want to worship Him and give Him the full glory that is due Him? Which I think it kind of goes hand in hand with truth. Light of the world is being the truth of the world, the absolute truth. And we seek that, we learn that, and then the beauty of the relationship and the worship falls into place, instead of the converse of that, seeking something to make us feel good versus what is true and good. And then the emotions follow into place.
Good points. You mentioned children in your conversation there, and one of the things the author points out is that nowhere in the Song of Solomon are children mentioned. Many of us think the reason for sexuality is procreation, and that's why it's there. Never once in the Song of Solomon are children mentioned. So I think that's an interesting concept about the loving relationship between the couple. I watched the Bible Project video on this, and I had to chuckle because if you read the book through before you came, the descriptions of some of the adoration language, I'm not sure I'd want my teeth to be compared to the whiteness of sheep's teeth and those kinds of things. And the illustrator of the Bible Project kind of drew a picture of what we might look like if we were to put all of those descriptors together. What a real pretty package. So clearly love lets us see things in many ways that allow us to have that kind of inner look at beauty as opposed to the outer look at beauty. But for me, this song fits in the wisdom literature because it's one more way to say, come to me. Come to me, believe in me, follow me, and I will show you the path. If you seek my love and my forgiveness and my glory, then I will give you gifts that bring you pleasure and grace and mercy. But it's because you followed my path. It's because you've learned my ways and you believe in them and you want to be a part of that kind of following that kind of a path. So it made sense to me to fit this book. This book isn't here randomly. It's here for a purpose. So that helped me. Linda sent me some podcast dialogues about this book. Is there anything from those that you want to?
It's actually not a podcast, it's a overview of the Bible in 365 readings that goes through but not verse by verse. And he just approached it as the beginning of the book being lovers, and then the marriage, and then the maturation of love. And kind of broke it into three parts that I hadn't really thought about before.
Yeah. Other comments about this book?
I was thinking this could be an outreach, really, because the world they certainly view sex in a lot of different ways. And it's good to say, well, God created that, and He has a special context for that. And, be thankful for that as a Christian, that God created this for us. And, so it could be an outreach in just the right context.
Right. The author of the book suggests that, as I mentioned earlier, the scene for this book could be Adam and Eve in the garden while they were still unclothed and unashamed of their bodies, and their love was growing and maturing. And after their sin and that shame came, then that's kind of perpetuated the way we talk about sexuality from there on. And that it doesn't have to be that way, that we can still enjoy God's creation and God's love. Okay, that was a bell. I just want to thank you for your participation in these discussions, and you've been so patient with me when I wandered in my own wilderness. You've really helped me in many ways, and it's my belief as a longtime teacher that we learn more than we ever impart over the course of time. And that's certainly been the case for me this quarter. And I really appreciate for what and how you've helped me learn. So thanks for being here, and thank you for putting up with my wandering.